Right, the book of Job. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? All right, here we go. The book of Job. That comes right before the book. Amen. I'd watch Brother Cates come into class, and he'd have a Bible, and he'd just open it up to the book of Job, and then he'd start teaching. And he'd have all these facts and all this information, and I'd just be overwhelmed and in awe that he could do that. And so he encouraged me to want to be able to do that. Not that I've ever been able to do that, but I strive to be able to do that. Probably never get there, but he instilled a great love in me for this book. Job is, of course, you'll see in your notes that I handed out, it is, in fact, a literary masterpiece. It is a phenomenal piece of work. Let's notice some of the literary tributes paid to the book by literary scholars. Tomorrow, if all literature was to be destroyed, and it was left to me to retain one work only, I would save Job. Victor Hugo. The book of Job, taken as a mere work of literary genius, is one of the most wonderful productions of any age or any language. Daniel Webster. One of the grandest things ever written. Thomas Carlyle. The book of Job rises like a pyramid in the history of literature, without a predecessor and without a rival. Philip Schaff. Magnificent and sublime as no other book. Martin Luther stated that. Unexcelled in literature. George Moore. It contains three canons of greatness. Dimension of height brings one nearer to the eternal stars of light, possesses dimension of breadth, universal qualities joining the whole world as kin. Depth goes into the soul of man. Reichert, Jewish scholar. When we look at Job, it bears internal and external marks of inspiration. And we look at that anytime we study a book, whether it's an Old Testament or a New Testament book, we want to look at the internal and the external marks that it has, referring to inspiration. Job 19:25 states, "For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth." Only an inspired writer could even make a statement like that. How would he know to even offer up that kind of knowledge? He wouldn't have any idea about that. Only an inspired writer. Job 26, verse 7, this is an amazing statement. "He stretches out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing." How would Job know that? At the time that he lived, how would he know that the earth is in an orbit, that nothing is holding it up, because there were tales and different ideas and beliefs of things regarding that. And Job said the earth hangs upon nothing. He wouldn't know that unless God had told him. In addition, Job 38 offers questions and comments about the natural things of the earth, and Brother Jim talked about some of those things. The way that the waters were separated upon the earth, things of that nature. How would Job know to write those things down unless he was in an actual conversation with the Creator of heaven and earth? Here are some things I want us to consider when we're reading the book of Job. Now, this is an 8-week course. We're not going to be able to have as an in-depth study of the book of Job as I would like for us to have, but I want us to consider this, and consider these things as you study Job on your own. Was Job a true and a historical person? There are a lot of folks out there, skeptics, who say, no, Job was not. He's a mythical character. It's okay to use the word character when you're talking about people in the Bible. I personally stopped doing that a long time ago, because when you use the word character, and again, it's not wrong to do that. If people want to talk about the characters that we study in the Bible, that's okay. Just from a personal point, I stopped doing that, because when you talk about characters, I associate that with tales, bedtime stories, things like that, okay? Now, again, not that it's wrong, and I understand what people are talking. You're talking about the people that the accounts are about, okay? And it's okay to talk about the stories of the Bible. It's okay to do that. I just personally started talking about the accounts of the Bible and things like that. But look, that's just my personal preference. It's not wrong to do otherwise. I would never say that that's what anyone has to do. But just from teaching classes like apologetics or things of that nature, and having to deal with the skeptics and things like that, I'm more conscientious of it. Again, not that anyone has to do it, but people will take someone like Job and they'll say Job never existed. It's just too outlandish of a quote story for him to be a real person. Well, Job, we're going to talk about that. When did Job live? What time frame are we talking about? Was he a patriarch? Did he live during the time of Moses? Did he live during the time of Solomon? What evidence do we have when he lived? Okay, those are some things we're going to notice. Who destroyed Job? Did Satan destroy Job, or did God destroy Job? Well, if you talk to Job early on, who would he say destroyed him? God. And at the same time, though, he says God had every right to do it. So he wasn't bitter. He didn't like the situation, but he said God had every right. But did God destroy Job? Well, of course not. We're going to notice that. What kind of person was Job? What do we learn about human suffering and the ways in which Job responded to that? Well, that tells us a lot about Job, doesn't it? We learn a lot about the person of Job. And listen, when we study people like Job, or we study the book of Job, why are we doing that, by the way? Why do we want to do that? What's the whole purpose? We have to make application to our... Job's been dead for a very long time. If we're not making some kind of an application, what's the point? Romans 15:4, right? It's there for our learning. So we have to make the application. When we look at what kind of a person Job was, we have to also understand what is evil. What is that? We have to be able to identify it. If we're going to understand what that thing we call good is, well, we have to understand what evil is. Because evil did come upon Job. Now here's something else I want us to consider. We're going to come across these people referred to as the sons of God. The sons of God. Are the sons of God spoken of in Job different from those spoken of in Genesis chapter 6, verses 2 and 4? Using the same phraseology. I think so. I think we're talking about different people, because in Genesis chapter 6, the sons of God married the daughters of men, right? So then there became a problem in the world, right? A problem happened. Well, in Job, the sons of God were presenting themselves before God. And then along comes Satan, because he had an obligation as well. So we need to understand who are the sons of God. Well, just kind of as a spoiler alert, they're angels. They're angels standing before God. Who is Satan? Who is Satan, and how in the world does Satan have access to the presence of God in this account of Job? Does he have access to the throne of God right now? Well, isn't that a good question? Can he come into the very presence of God right now and operate this way? Oh, that's a good question, isn't it? Well, we'll talk about that. Was Job wrong or right when he stated the Lord took away his possessions and his children? Did the Lord take them away? And what about this? Why didn't Satan kill Job's wife when he killed his children? What kind of friends did Job have? Is it good to be the type of friend that Job had who came and visited him in his misery? Do we want to be those kinds of friends? Did Job sin when he wished he had never been born and wished he could die? Was that wrong of Job to do that? That's a tough question. What was the philosophy of his friends, and was that a valid philosophy? So he had these three friends that showed up, and ultimately a fourth one came on the scene, right? And they began to have all these ideas and philosophies that they were telling Job what he was doing. Were those reasonable? And should we have those? Were they valid? What about this? Who wrote this book? Was this a... Okay, well, some people say no one knows. I think we can determine pretty quickly who wrote the book. Who wrote the book? But it's a good question, because anytime you study a book, well, that's one of the things you want to try to determine. Who was the human author of the book? Now, we all know who the ultimate author was, right? It was the Holy Spirit. But who actually was the penman here on earth, right? Now, here is the question. I think this is maybe the what was that game show that used to be on TV, the $24,000 question. Between whom was the battle? Was the battle between Satan and Job? That's a good question. There is a great battle waged, and we need to determine who are the combatants, because there is a huge battle being fought in this book of Job. What about this one? Where is Uz? Do we read about Uz anywhere else outside the book of Job? Uz. Huh? Well, he came out of Ur, didn't he? Yeah, he came out of Ur, Chaldees. But Uz, I know for sure, where we know for sure, somewhere in the east, right? Because Job was the greatest man in the east. But Uz that's kind of an odd name. We might talk a little more about that. Now, here is something, too, we need to consider. Who is the greatest sufferer in the book of Job? Well, when at face value, we look at it and we say, well, it's Job. Look at all he lost. But is Job really the greatest sufferer in the book of Job? I don't think so. But it's a good question. I think we'll get to the bottom of it. Let's talk about the book itself. Job is a book of poetry. And when you look at it immediately, you say, well, I don't know. How can Job be a book of poetry? Well, we understand the Psalms is a book of poetry. Maybe we can understand how Proverbs is a book of poetry, but Job is a poem. Job is a Hebrew poem, and it is a poem about suffering and faith. Anytime we get the feeling like that we are suffering too much, and that God is putting way too much on us. He's expecting too much out of us. We need to, in my Bible, flip over to page 555 and begin to read about this man called Job. Job lost everything. Now, he didn't lose his wife, but she wasn't much help to him in his time of crisis. And that may be worse. I don't know. That may be worse. It is mostly a book of poetry, and it exemplifies most types of Hebrew parallelism. Okay? The author was a master of metaphor. Okay? Job 14, 2 and verses 7 through 12 is a good example of that. Quotations play a significant role in the book, though sometimes they're difficult to find. Direct quotations from a speaker's thoughts are found in chapter 7, verse 4. Quotations of a previous speaker's point of view is chapter 31, beginning with verse 1. A similar place or a similar writing is Proverbs 32, 6 through 8. It also exemplifies almost every style of Old Testament writing. You have lamentations, you have complaints, you have hymns, you have proverbs, and you have rhetorical questions. Not many more styles than that available to us in the Old Testament. Now here's something about the book of Job. It has universal appeal. Okay? When we consider something's appeal, its appeal is found in its universality. Okay? Such as the place, the time, the persons. Okay? Do the people of the account, do they develop? Have you ever watched a movie or read a book and it just wasn't very good because the characters in the book or the characters in the movie, they just didn't develop? You know, they started out however they started out, and they just didn't grow. They didn't develop either in their moral character or in their any other way, right? They didn't develop into anything. And you're just reading the same thing all the way through. That's not very appealing, and it doesn't make the movie or the book very appealing as you read it. You want to see some kind of growth in the characters. You know, whether it's positive or negative, right? If he's a villain, will you expect negative? He goes into a spiral. That's what makes him a villain. Every hero needs a villain to fight against, right? If you're looking in literature or listening to a song or watching a movie. But all people, listen, that's real life though, isn't it? All people develop. We're not static. If we're not developing positively, what are we doing? We're getting worse. We're getting worse. As Christians, if we're not growing, what are we doing? We're dying. We're dying as Christians spiritually. Okay? If we have children, we have a baby, if that baby isn't growing, what do? We go straight to the doctor. Something's wrong. Right? We want to know why that child is not growing. Now, there's a lot of literature in the world. It's not worth anything. It doesn't answer any questions. It doesn't provide even any entertainment because nothing's happening in the literature. Right? It's not worth anything to us. They don't deal with these persons, times, and places universally that appeal to us. They don't have any redeeming qualities to them. In whatever aspect that it's supposed to be appealing or entertaining. The Bible is unlike those books. The Bible is different. Outside of the religious aspect of the Bible, if you look at the Bible just as a piece of literature, you have action, you have love stories, you have all of these things in the Bible. It's an amazing piece of literature. Because why? It deals with people who are evolving in their character. Their character is doing something because they're real people. But it deals with the things that are universal. People, places, times that mean something to us, the reader. We can identify with those people. Why can we identify with Job? He's suffering. He's suffering. Have any of us ever suffered? Well, maybe the better question is, have we ever stopped suffering in some ways, right? I mean, we all suffer. And so we can identify with him. The Bible deals with universally recurring themes. Where did I come from? How did I get here? Okay? What is my purpose in life? There has to be something for me, not just after this life, but while I'm here. While I'm here. Everybody needs to feel worth, right? Am I worth something? Do I need, what can I be doing? Well, God has something in store for us. Where am I going when this life is over? Job deals with those things of a universal nature, okay? Now, the people that we're going to study in this book, they will develop either positively or they will develop negatively, okay? Job changes in the book. He's going to develop one way or the other. Now, we're going to look at him and we're going to make an application and we're going to put ourselves in Job's place. How would I respond to the things happening to Job? Would I develop positively, or would I become bitter and mean and hateful and become angry? So that's something we need to understand. Here are some of the universal themes in the book. Obviously, we're going to talk about Satan. We're going to talk about Satan. He appears on the scene almost immediately. We're going to talk about evil, what it is. We're going to talk about the battle between right and wrong, good and bad. We're going to talk about sorrow upon a person's death. Okay? We're going to talk about grief. We're going to talk about being mistreated although a person is innocent. Does that happen? Do bad things happen to good people? Well, sure they do. Here is something that's great. Here is a theme throughout Job. Redemption. That's a beautiful thing. We're going to talk about a Redeemer. The bodily resurrection. Was Job a real person? Liberals and higher critics say no. They say he personifies man and how man in general suffers. Job was a historical person, an actual person. The prophet Ezekiel spoke of Job in Ezekiel 14 through 20. He mentions three people. He mentions Noah, he mentions Daniel, and he mentions Job. And in that passage, what Ezekiel is doing, he is saying that Judah is so sorry and so wicked and so evil that if Noah and Daniel and Job were in the land, that the only people that would be saved in the land and the only good that they could do in the land would be to save themselves because of their own righteousness. Everybody else would be lost. So he's recognizing that Noah, Daniel, and Job are actual people. Now here's why that lends itself. Ezekiel did his work around 830 BC. Okay? And we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on Ezekiel, but he prophesied between the second and third captivity about the wickedness of Judah. And he was contemporary for a while, okay, with, when was it, I gave you the wrong date there. Daniel was alive when Ezekiel wrote in 597 to 586. That's the correct date. Yeah. So he was contemporary for a period with Daniel. Okay? Everybody recognized Noah. The Lord wrote about Noah. So does it make sense that Ezekiel is going to mention two actual people and then throw a mythical person in the group? That doesn't make sense, does it? That's not rational. And so he was an actual person. Okay, all three people. But if we want to understand our Lord, we are going to be able to better understand Him if we understand the book of Job. Okay? James wrote this, James 5 verse 11. Behold, we count them happy which endure. You've heard of the patience of Job, and you've seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. The book shows the end of the Lord. He is very pitiful, meaning full of pity. Okay? And of tender mercy, meaning full of mercy. Okay? If one does not see the pity and mercy of God in Job, well, we've missed the point of the entire book. We've missed the point of the entire book. Most do not think about the book of Job as being a description of God. But here's the thing. The book isn't about Job. The book is more about God than it is about the book of Job. And we have to understand that when we study the book of Job. We learn more about God in the book of Job than what people realize. We learn about the character of God. We learn about the love of God, and we learn about the mercy of God. Many people look at the book and they see God as some kind of unloving, vicious individual because of what happens to Job. It's not God's fault what happens to Job. And we have to understand that. We have to come to terms to that. People look at what happened to the Christ and they say, well, God's some kind of unloving, non-compassionate person because of the way the Christ suffered on the cross. Well, that's exactly the total opposite of what we ought to get out of the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross. He is the most loving and the most compassionate for Christ's suffering on the cross. So again, let's go back. Who is the greatest sufferer in the book of Job? Who suffered the most while Christ was on the cross? God suffered the most, didn't He? The Father. He suffered the most while Christ was on the cross. Who suffered the most when Job, the person whom God was so proud of, in Job 1 verse 8, was being so viciously mistreated, and God had to allow it to happen. Could God have stopped it? Could He have just annihilated Satan and stopped all that from happening? And what would have happened to humanity if God had taken all that away and Job would not have had to have chosen? It would have been the end of it, wouldn't it? So God is the greatest sufferer. How would it feel, those of us who have children, how would it feel to have to watch a child suffer? Oh, I can't imagine. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and we were talking about the Lord and His suffering in the garden, and the Father having to witness that. Not for decent people. It's not that He just suffered for decent people. He suffered for the sorriest people in the world. Now listen, that's saying a lot. Okay? People who mistreat and abuse the most innocent of society, that's who He died for. Now we need to consider that for a moment. How many of us would give a child of ours for those folks? I'm not giving a child of mine for the best in society. Okay? God is the greatest sufferer in the book of Job. So when did Job live? Job lived during the patriarchal age, following the flood. His name is mentioned in secular writings around the time of Abraham, around 1400 BC in some Egyptian excretion tablets. Abraham lived around 2000 BC. Okay? Job served as, now here's why we know, here's something we need to consider when you're reading the book of Job. Who served as priest during the time Job lived for sacrifices and worship of God? Who was the priest at Job's house? Job was, wasn't he? Job was the priest. During the patriarchal period, the head of the clan or the head of the home served as the priest. That's what the patriarchs did. And that's how we know Abel was married. Okay? That's how we know Abel was married. He was offering a sacrifice, wasn't he? Cain came along, murdered him. Job mediated for his friends as a type of Christ. And Christ is often seen and should be seen in the book of Job. Job was not of the Levitical priesthood. That was way into the future. Now here's something else we know why he was a patriarch. He gave an inheritance to his daughters. They inherited just like his sons did. That was not under the law of Moses. Now, according to the law of Moses, that only happened if a man died without a son. Numbers 27, verse 6. Okay? Numbers 27, verse 6. Also, his age indicates that he was a patriarch. Okay? He was a patriarch. Now, if he, let's just do a little bit of assuming here. Let's say he married around the age of 20. Let's allow 10 years to have children, 20 years for them to reach adulthood. That's at least 50 years. Okay? If we look in Job 7 verse 3, he endured months of misery. Now think about that. Months of misery. A misery like no one else other than the Lord probably has ever endured on this earth. And then he lived an additional 140 years. That would have made him at least 190 when he died. Okay? So all this happened to him when he was relatively a young man. Okay? That is, if he married at the age of 20, he might have been older when he married. God could have doubled his age, meaning he might have lived 70 years prior to that. So he might have married, he might have been 70 when this happened to him. So, so he could have died at the age of 210 plus at the time of his, plus the time of his destruction or whatever. So he could have lived that long. But at any rate, that indicates that he lived during the patriarchal years, okay? Because that's when they lived those extended periods of time. Job likely lived about 2,000 years before Christ. Here's something else. What did Job do when he began to mourn? He sat in ashes, but he did something that was forbidden under the law of Moses. He shaved his head. That was forbidden, Deuteronomy 14, 1 through 2, but he was not rebuked for doing that. Okay? Wasn't rebuked for doing that. The book was written in early Aramaic or early Hebrew, not in the language of Moses or Solomon. Okay? Not in the language of Moses or Solomon. He mentions the flood. He mentioned dinosaurs. But he did not mention the promise of Abraham or Abraham himself. He didn't mention the Exodus. He didn't mention giving the law, the wilderness wanderings. the conquest of Canaan, the tabernacle, or the temple. He didn't mention the Levitical priesthood or the kingdom of Israel. Now, if Moses had been the author, as some have mentioned, wouldn't he certainly have mentioned some of that stuff if Moses had been the author? So I don't think that he was he certainly lived prior to that. We don't read about Gentile offering sacrifices for the remission of sins after the giving of the law of Moses. We do read about those who traveled along with the Jews in the wilderness, Leviticus 17:8. But strangers were uncircumcised Gentiles. Okay? Proselytes were not called strangers. Okay? So, what is this book about? If we had to describe this book to some folks and we had to give a quick idea of what it was about, here's a few things we might say. It is about the problem of human suffering. Okay? That is one of the things that when you talk to an atheist or a skeptic, if God is a loving God and an all-powerful God, why is there suffering in the world? Either He's not loving or He's not all-powerful. Well, we can read the book of Job and we can understand in a hurry that's not true. It's about evil. It's about the nature of God. And ultimately, it's about the worthiness of God. That's kind of what it boils down to. The worthiness of God. Okay? The author who wrote the book. Can you tell me anyone better than Job himself to write the book of Job? I can't think of anyone. Some say Moses, Solomon, or someone unknown. I think we've mentioned that. If Moses or Solomon, the whole book would have had to have been revealed to the writer. Of course, God could have done that, but I don't think that makes much sense. I think Job wrote the book. This is a first-hand account of the very man of whom the book is talking about. Job made some mistakes in the book, but throughout the account, we're reading about how he did not sin. He just didn't understand. And I think that God takes that into account when He looks at the terrible things that are happening to Job. Even when he says God was the force behind the things happening to him, he says God had every right to do it. Even when he gets a little bit beyond where he should be in his thinking, and he says, well, I have a few questions for God. He pretty quickly, when God says, okay, you have a few questions for me, well, you answer these questions first. He comes to himself pretty quickly and recognizes that, well, he's in no position to ask God anything. So I think God recognizes that Job is under some pretty rough stress, and so he allows Job to offer sacrifice for his good friends, and so we don't see a lot of rebuke going toward Job. Okay, it makes sense that within this idea of divine economy, that God doesn't waste time, energy, or space, that Job wrote the book. So again, when did Job live? It seems likely that Job lived sometime before Abraham, probably around Genesis 10 or 11 would probably be the date. I don't think God would have left himself without witness between the time of Noah and Abraham. Any comments, questions? Age? Well, he was more than 140 because he lived an additional 140 years. Well, we're not told. Job is a book that stands alone. Okay, Job is a book that stands alone. He's mentioned by other writers, but he doesn't, fit in a chronology. But we have to look at his lifestyle and the things he did to understand that he's after the flood, but he has to be before Abraham because he doesn't mention him. So I think he's probably there, probably around Genesis 10 or 11. Well, he probably lived he wouldn't have lived much more than 200 years in age, because he lived from the time that he was restored an additional 140 years. Okay, yeah. Huh? Yeah, he lived an additional 140 years. And if he was, like we said, if he was 20 when he married and had children, that would have put him about 50. And he had children again. So from the time he was restored, he would have been about 50 if he married when he was 20. If he was 70 when he was destroyed, okay, and God doubled everything, and then he lived an additional 140 years, so he doubled his age, he would have been about 210. So I don't know that that's how old he was, but he wouldn't have lived much more than 200 years. So he was a patriarch. Any other questions, comments? All right, well, let's look into the text a little bit, see how far we get. Chapter 1, the first 3 chapters are some of the greatest chapters in the book. Chapter 1, the account begins, there was a man whose name was Job. The land in which he lived was Uz. It was likely east of the Jordan in Palestine. It would have been the type of location where he could have pastures. He could have had his livestock. When they were going in to take the land of Canaan, what did those 2.5 tribes want to do prior to going over west of the Jordan River? They liked that property, didn't they? Why? You remember? Had all that pasture land. Had all that Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. They said, let us stay on this side because we have all these cattle. And so that's what Job had. He had cattle, so it's likely he might have been on that side of the Jordan River. Okay? And so that would have been the kind of location that he would have liked. Now, Job is described this way: perfect, upright, one who feared God and eschewed evil. This word perfect is not sinlessly perfect. It's mature. Mature. When we're talking about a person, okay, perfect can mean complete. But when we're talking about somebody, that's a mature person, a mature follower of God. He'd put some time in following God, and he was being what God needed him to be. God describes the man this way. He avoided evil, and he was upright. And so God, what do we think God intends by these adjectives? Because he admits to having sin in his life. He's offering sacrifices, right? He's offering sacrifices. In fact, he's offering them for his sons and his daughters. Well, it means he's striving, right? He's trying hard. He's trying to be exactly what God wants him to be. He's not living in sin. He's not a sinner. He's not a sinner. He's faithful to God under the law in effect at that time. Now, he had all these children, 7 sons and 3 daughters. That was highly prized and valued in the ancient world at that time. You have a large family? Well, people respected that, and they looked up to that. Okay? Now, that's not so highly prized in modern society, is it? You have such a large family, and people kind of make fun of you a little bit. I can recall we would, when our children were small, we would be out in public, and people would kind of give us sideways looks a little bit because we had 4 children. I don't think that's necessarily that many. You know how many children my grandmother had? She had 13. I was like, man, how in the world can you handle 13 children? Of course, I mean, obviously you don't have 13 little ones at one time, but they were pretty close together. Maybe a year or 2 apart. And that's a lot of kids at one time. And, of course, that's free help on the farm, I guess. But I remember one time we'd go to Costco when we lived in Memphis, and they'd have a sale on milk. I'd buy 5 or 6 gallons at one time. People's eyes would get big, and And, you'd be shocked if the people had something to say because you got 5 or 6 gallons of milk. And I finally started telling people, they'd say, "Boy, you got a lot of children?" I said, "No, I've got a lot of cats. Got a lot of cats at home. That's what I feed my cats." But God sees children as a blessing. Psalm 127, 3 through 5. Yeah. Well, it's still a blessing. Yeah, children are still a blessing. Yeah, whether you have 1 or 20, they're a blessing. 1 or 20 is a blessing. And but Job was very wealthy. He's described as the greatest man of the East, and his wealth was the greatest of all his generation. Boy, that says something, doesn't it? So here's what we can learn from that as well. Wealth isn't wrong. It's not wrong to have a lot of wealth. I love it when faithful members of the Lord's church are wealthy. Okay? I mean, who else would you want to be wealthy? I want Christians to be wealthy. I want them to do well. Okay? The list of his possessions in chapter 1 was enormous. Okay? Their wealth at that time was determined by their possessions, livestock, children, homes, things of that nature. When we read about Abraham in Genesis 14, he had his own personal army, 318 trained servants. So when Lot goes off and gets himself captured, Abraham can go retrieve that boy on his own. He doesn't have to go for help. He goes and gets 300 of his own army and goes and rescues his nephew. That's how wealthy Abraham was. But here's what's so great about Job. Job was wealthy financially, but he was concerned about the spiritual welfare of his children. He would go offer sacrifice for his children in case of what? They had sinned against God. He was concerned about that. Okay? He was concerned about that. He didn't know of any sin they had done. We're not told they were sinners. But just in case, he was worried about their spiritual welfare. Now, in verses 6 through 12, we'll talk about that real quick because we're out of time here almost. We've got a minute or two. We have this council in heaven. The sons of God present themselves before God, and of course they had to be angels. 1 Kings 22, Job 38:7. This is different from Genesis 6:2 because angels do not marry. Okay? We know that because of Matthew 22:30. Okay? Angels do not marry. The sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 were marrying. So these are angels convening in heaven. And in verse 7, what we have here is we do not have Satan just frolicking around doing what he wants to. He was required by God to present himself, to give an account of what he had been doing. Okay, so what we see is at that time, he was given more leeway to do what he was doing. Okay, the chain was let out a little further on the dog than it is at this time. Why is that? What was going on during that period of time? Obviously, living during the miraculous period, weren't they? Satan could cause things to happen that he can't cause to happen right now. He was drawn in, and he can't do the things he was doing at that time. Okay? And he had that opportunity and that ability to do things all the way up to the point Christ died on the cross. Okay? So God asked Satan a question. What have you been doing? Did God not know what Satan had been doing? Well, certainly he did. So why ask the question? He asked that question the same reason he asked the question over in Genesis chapter 3. He wanted Adam to know where Adam was. Where are you, Adam? Well, Adam needed to understand where he was. He's asking this question in Job to get the conversation over where God wanted it to be. He directed the conversation. Well, I've been going to and fro about, up and down, over and yonder. he was doing exactly how Peter described him over in 1 Peter 5, verse 8. Now, there's a lot about this meeting we don't understand, but we do know Satan is subject to God. That's the main thing we need to take away here. He's subject to God. He can't do just whatever he wants to do. And then God describes Job to Satan. Have you considered my servant Job? Do you know how that just chapped Satan when God told Job, or told Satan that? You consider my servant Job. Oh, he's upright and he's faithful. He eschews evil. You can't get him. Oh, the challenge, the gauntlet has been thrown down, and then the attack begins. And it begins not a physical attack immediately, right? That's not how it begins. It begins by what? How do most attacks begin? First, talking, saying something. Well, did you hear what Amber had done? She went over and did this. As you're whispering, right? You're whispering behind someone's back. Well, basically that's what Satan's doing. He's whispering behind Job's back, right? And so that is what happened. And so the accuser tells God, well, he's only serving you because look what you've given him. What does that mean? God's not worthy of worship. You can't buy. You can't be loved for who you are. You have to buy it. If you weren't buying love, Job wouldn't serve you. You're not worthy of worship. Okay? And so it was miserable for Satan to hear that. So Satan accused God of having Job hemmed in with this protective fence. And then so that's when Satan proposed this test. You take away the prosperity. You take away the things that you've given him. And what did Satan say Job would do? Curse you to your face. Curse you right to your face. So what God allows Satan to do is implement his plan, but here's what he says. You can't touch him physically. Can't touch him physically. Take his stuff away, and let's see what happens. And we'll pick up there next time. Thank you so much.